Sorry, we're live, are we?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll just unmute Paul.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us. I have to apologize from the beginning because I am in Heathrow Airport. I've been unfortunate, had to fly away very quickly, but not for lack of trying. Your team at Edgeware have been phenomenally patient with me, and I'm still able to host the ZF, myself, this evening and talk to you a little bit about Israel. You might hear a little bit of background noise, so I do apologize. But in any event, we are here and I am hugely grateful and honored to be able to represent the Zionist Federation. My name is Paul Charney and be here tonight with you. And hopefully we can discuss a little bit about the current situation in Israel. There's always a current situation in Israel and it's always changing. But tonight, let's look into the future a little bit and let's see what we think is going to happen. So thank you for joining us tonight. Everybody can remain on mute, would be helpful. And towards the end of the hour, we will be able to have some Q&A questions. There is a chat box which you can enter your questions into, but either way, towards the end, your hosts will be able to monitor the questions and hopefully I'll be able to answer them to your satisfaction. So, as I said, we're here on behalf of the Zionist Federation of UK and Ireland. The Zionist Federation, for those of you who know it and been involved, pretty much is here to connect you, the Jewish community in the UK and Ireland, to Israel. We spend our lives pretty much doing that. We are made up, it's the one true organization of people who just love Israel. That's pretty much what we do. The Zionist Federation was established in 1899. It was the Zionist Federation, which was mentioned in the Balfour Declaration of 1917. Lord Balfour, who sent the declaration to Lord Rothschild, and please bring this to the attention of the Zionist Federation that we view with favor a Jewish state and a Jewish homeland, the Jewish people. The Zionist Federation has continued through 1948 and continues till today. And today we are the largest constituent, holding the largest constituents of members. We have 36 member groups with around 50,000 affiliate members from all different Israeli political organizations and groups. So we try to represent those groups, a wide ranging of groups, and we try to pretty much bring Israel closer to you as we will do tonight. So that's a little bit about the Zionist Federation. Please go online and have a look at the Zionist Federation website. We host a number of fantastic events, and we do also a number of parties, and we do the big Yom Ha'atzmaut party, which hopefully we'll be able to do next year. But still, I would love to be able to be here in person and speak to you, but we are here on Zoom, so relax, take your feet off, and let's see if we can get started. Right, Israel today, where are we? So Israel is hugely impacted by everything that happens in America. America sneezes, Israel catches a cold. Where are we today with America? American elections. These American elections have a huge impact on everything that's going to happen to Israel now and in the next 4 years. What we saw was a Trump presidency which supported Israel no matter what. It also took huge steps. It took steps that were unrecognizable by many of the international community, but steps which were necessary for Israel to advance as a nation. We saw the US President Trump bring the embassy to Jerusalem. And let me tell you something, every president before that was supposed to bring the embassy to Jerusalem. It's the Jewish capital of Israel, but never did it because they thought there would be riots on the streets, because there would be war amongst the Arab nations, but that never happened. So Israel's capital, Jerusalem, is recognized by, of course, the American capital being present there, and a number of other countries have followed. We've seen the Abraham Accords. The Abraham Accords is a normalization of Israel. I remind you, John Kerry, the former foreign minister of the former Secretary of State of the US, said very clearly, there will never be normalization with Arab states for Israel until they make a deal with the Palestinians. Well, we saw that wasn't true. Israel is now starting to have normalization with the first three countries with UAE, with Bahrain and Sudan, and more to come. We have also seen a huge amount of military support between the US and Israel, with an extension of the military package that Israel receives, a defense package, as recognized in America. But now we have seen there is a new president that's been elected, Biden, and what is to come? What does Israel think of Biden? What does Israel think of Trump? Well, let me start first by saying that Israel, as the public, loved Trump. If Trump was running for an election in Israel, it would win by a 75% margin. But the Israeli government was very wary of Trump. Trump is absolutely unpredictable. We don't like unpredictable. We don't know what Trump is going to do. Trump will fly to North Korea and speak with his best friend in order to make peace. Israel was not sure. Now you have an American president in its first 4 years, which still is slightly muted. The second 4 years, where you don't have to run for a second. It doesn't take, you spend your first 4 years trying to run for the next 4 years and become re-elected. Well, Trump in the second 4 years, we don't know what he would be doing. He could try to make a deal with Iran, and in order to try and appease, because Iran is a big problem for America in itself. It's a huge, it's probably America's greatest enemy. But if Trump managed to force Iran to the table as it's doing, might throw Israel into the pack as well in order to make a deal with Iran to get them to stop the nuclear weapons. We don't know what Trump was doing. In fact, one of the particular problems with the Abraham Accords, the deal between the normalization deal with Israel and the Abraham and UAE, is that America conceded to supply F-35 fighter jets to UAE. Now, Israel is America is contractually obliged to keep Israel having a military advantage. It is by law that America needs to keep that for Israel. By supplying F-35s to the UAE, that erodes that military advantage, and Israel was not happy. In fact, many strategists in Israel said, we'd rather not have this peace deal if the UAE are going to receive these F-35s, the greatest fighter jet that's ever been made and developed in America. Israel has the F-35s. Israel needs to keep that military advantage. The UAE gets taken over by another country or becomes extremist. Guess where those F-35s might land up? We don't know. So Israel, in fact, was not happy about this. And this is still a huge sticking point with the UAE. So we don't know with Trump. Now, in the second 4 years of Trump, Israel didn't know. So Israel is always slightly skeptical. Trump is also quite volatile. If somebody says the wrong thing, then under Israel was worried that under the next wild Trump, Bibi and Trump would not get on, and Trump would decide to hold this against Israel as well. It's pretty similar to what happened in the last few months of the Obama era. Obama decided to bypass the Senate, bypass norm with Israel, and take Israel to the UN and take it to task. And for the first time, vote against Israel on a UN resolution holding Israel responsible. And that was a real problem. That was seen as a weak attempt to try and get back at Bibi Netanyahu personally. It was seen as a weak attempt by Obama to try and punish Israel for not listening to at the time, Obama. We have now a situation where Biden is going to come to the next 4 years, but we also have a couple of months. Trump is now president with really no accountability, other than legal accountability with the Senate, but he's got zero accountability. He has now got free reign. He's not looking for another election. He's got 2 months. He has now free reign to do what he wants when he wants. Nobody knows. People in America are worried. People are worried. Nobody knows in 2 months, and he can do a lot of damage. We've got Biden coming in January. Now, how is Biden viewed in Israel? Well, let's start off first by saying Biden is one of the old school Democrats. The old school Democrats hold Israel dear, hold Israel as strategic alliances of Israel dearer than any other country. The greatest the greatest joint cooperation in military and intelligence is between America and Israel throughout the world. America needs Israel in the Middle East, no doubt, especially since it's losing its grip slightly to Russia, to Turkey, to China when it comes to Syria and Iran, because that's where Syria and Iran are going to for support. So Israel becomes even more strategically important to America. Biden is of an old school, fully supportive of Israel, but he's a Democrat, which means he's not going to want to hear any more talk of annexation. He's not going to hear any more talk of settlements or continued West Bank growth. He doesn't want to hear that. He wants to see the old traditional, bring the Palestinians back into the frame, give funding back to the Palestinians, and let's see a peace deal be made on the back of a two-state solution. So he will support Israel. And in some sense, some Israeli leadership are happier because they know Biden. They can trust Biden. There's not going to be any volatile, any sudden movements and sudden change decisions. That's not going to happen under Biden. I remind you as well that it's not just the president that makes these decisions. All of his advisors. It's always been like that and always will. So in some sense, the Israelis are slightly more satisfied. Yes.
Paul, sorry, the sound, it's okay, but all of a sudden it starts going all gurgly.
Okay.
And it's, it's very spasmodic. So it's 1 minute it's okay, now it's not.
Right.
Do you want to carry on? But bear in mind that, I mean,
I'll speak a bit slower.
Yeah. So carry on, if not, James can take over.
And we'll continue to monitor.
Let me know.
Yeah, okay. Carry on and let's see what happens. Apologies.
I will carry on.
Yeah, okay.
So,
sorry, carry on.
So what is Biden's going to do? The biggest threat that Biden can do to Israel is continue to try and bring America back into the JCPOA, which is the agreement with Iran. Biden was absolutely supportive of Obama when they made this deal with Iran, and it's going to look to bring it back in. But we now have a Republican Senate. We also have Biden knowing that he can't simply do what he likes. So to bring America back into the Iranian agreement will need more concessions from Iran. It won't be so easy, and they can hold Iran to a higher standard. But I don't think the Republicans will allow him to even bring America back into the Iran. Iran are still a big problem for America. It's a strategic advantage for Biden to have a Republican Senate because he can go back to Iran and say, as a negotiating point, I can't bring a deal unless you give in, which Iran have been doing for long enough. But Trump has shown that you can make deals and you can bring these regimes to its knees. Biden won't do that. Biden is a politician. He's not a deal maker. So that becomes a real problem. But it's not just a problem for Israel. This is a big problem for Saudi Arabia, for the UAE, for Bahrain, and for all the Emirates, for all the Gulf Emirates. This is a big problem. Iran still view Bahrain as one of its own states. It still views it as another potential opportunity to take land. Bahrain know this. UAE know this. And that's one of the reasons for the deals of the Abraham Accords, because of common interests with Israel, that Iran is a threat, a huge threat. So Biden will come into the presidency with a lot of pressure from Saudi Arabia and from the UAE and from all the Middle Eastern countries and from Israel about this Iranian deal. So he won't rush into it, and he might get more concessions. If he does it, there will be more concessions. So that's one of the big problems. But let's look at the Abraham Accords, shall we? What will Biden do? There has been momentum with Jared Kushner, with Pompeo, with Trump, to push the normalization of Israel with these Arab countries. And not just Arab countries, Muslim countries around the world. This normalization has momentum. These agreements have momentum. The Palestinians are nowhere to be found. Biden will bring the Palestinians back into the frame, and this will at best slow down, at worst stop altogether. But Biden and his team view the Abraham Accords as a good thing. They see it as a positive way forward because it's been done. They didn't have to break the ice, but now that the ice has been broken, let's continue. So they will continue. They will continue to try and bring these agreements. Morocco, Saudi Arabia, with Israel, but we don't know, but it will certainly slow down at best. So Israel has a problem now and needs to see what it's going to do with Iran. But from an intelligence point of view now, Israel has another big advantage. It has now normalized ties with a number of Arab countries in the Middle East. From an intelligence point of view, this gives Israel a huge advantage, Israel relies on the US. It relies on the US for cover to be able to go and do things. But it's got a huge advantage now. It can utilize the Arab countries for intelligence. It will be able to, these countries will be able to get into places of Iran that Israel was not able to do so. And because of common interests, they will work together. Israel will be very reluctant and hesitant to work with these Arab countries more than that, because obviously can't be trusted. But let's start off with Iran. Let's see what happens. Now, what is Iran doing at the moment? Well, Iran at the moment is playing quiet because Iran knows exactly the same thing that we do. There's 2 months left of Trump. 2 months left of Trump means don't stoke the flames, don't provoke the tiger, because if they do, they don't know what he can do. The last time they provoked him, their head of the Iranian, the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, Soleimani, was assassinated. He was probably one of the most powerful people in the Middle East, never mind in Iran. He was building infrastructure all around Israel to be able to attack Israel at whim, including tunnels, including military establishments in Syria, including a huge amount of infrastructure to attack Israel all the way from Lebanon, all the way down the Golan Heights and down to the bottom of the Syrian border. And Israel knew this. So we don't know how or why, but Trump decided to assassinate Soleimani. So Iran are not going to do anything at the moment because Trump has impunity to do what he likes. So they're going to keep very quiet. They made a mistake. They made one mistake, which probably wasn't even their mistake, that a couple of Syrians decided to put a few IEDs. These are bombs on the sides of roads in the Golan Heights, a few Syrians. Now, Israel saw this happen, and this happens regularly. This is not the first time. Israel not only went in hard militarily in the last few days, but announced it publicly that we've gone in, went in and took out a number of Syrian and Iranian establishments, military headquarters in Syria, all the way up to Damascus. With absolute impunity, Israel can do it because it knows, Israel, that if Iran retaliates again now at all, then Trump could decide to go in heavy and decide to do. Israel currently has an umbrella of impunity to do what it likes for the next few months with America. You know, I was in the tanks, and as a tank commander, as a tank officer, there were two ways of attacking, two speeds of attacking. One, where you have air support, where you have your Israeli air support, F-16s and F-35s, to go in and give you cover so that no helicopters are coming to try and get you. And one where you don't have the air support. Right now, Israel has that air support with the US. It can go at any speed, anywhere it wishes to go with absolute impunity. And that's what they know now, which is what Bibi and Israel military did. It took advantage of this time. It went in, saw a couple of IEDs, a few bombs on the sides of roads, and took out a number of military establishments, a number of Syrian anti-aircraft missiles. They reported on the other side that 10 were killed, Syrians and Iranians in Syria, which probably means a lot more, but I mean, that's not the point of this. Israel wasn't going out to try and kill people. What it was doing is taking out the infrastructure, which is very, very important for the defense of Israel. So Iran knows that. Iran is trying to stay quiet, and Israel will use any opportunity now to take. 6 to 8 months ago, Israel took out a very high-level Hezbollah agent in Lebanon. But again, because of the punity, because of the umbrella of America and Trump, Israel can do these things, and it takes advantage of it. So Iran at the moment is worried. Who does Iran want as president? No doubt wants Biden. Iran is worried with Trump, but it wants a Biden presidency, made very clear. So they keep it quiet for the next few months, and then they're going to play their own. They're very smart, the Iranians. They're going to play a chess game when they come to the table to enter into this agreement again. Iran continue to try and use Syria as its own base to establish a base to forward terrorist acts on Israel and to potentially attack Israel. Israel decided when the Syrian war started not to allow Iran onto the borders. Its objective was geographically, proximity-wise, not to allow them anywhere near Israel's borders, and not to allow any chemical or biological weapons to be transferred between from the Syrian establishment into Lebanon. So Israel took that as an objective and has continued military action throughout the Syrian conflict, and has performed a number of military tasks in Syria, taking these weapons out and taking these establishments out, making it very clear. And that could have started a war, but it hasn't. Iran knows very clearly Israel will not have another enemy on another border. So that's where Iran are at the moment. But Iran does have a cover as well. Iran is supported, indirectly supported by Russia, by Turkey, by Qatar, and by China in this particular area. When it comes to the Middle East, you can be friends in one part and you can be absolute enemies in another area. But the Middle East can get very complicated. Turkey wants its foothold in the Middle East. China wants to continue to grow and to take control. Russia feels it's still the old Cold War, even though Russia is the oldest population and slowly dying out. It wants to still feel it has control. Putin, who wants to have military control. So it is supporting Iran and supporting Syria, and Qatar. And Qatar is another big problem. And Qatar is not only just a supporter, a moral support, but a financial supporter of Hamas regularly and publicly. And that's a real problem. But Israel has managed to make new friends with the UAE, with Bahrain, with Sudan. And the UAE do not have a good relationship with Qatar. Qatar have their own spokespeople, which is Al Jazeera, and constantly undermine the king in UAE, the sheikh, and all the royal family, constantly to try and delegitimize, to try and chip away. So there are many areas where Israel and the UAE are going to be performing now, and we will yet see where that's going to come. Another big point which is going to affect Israel, which has started already, is Israel's new gas deals. Israel is now a provider of gas. You know, with the old joke where Moses walked in the desert and found the one spot in the Middle East with no oil. But you know what? He didn't walk through the right sea as well, because that's where the Mediterranean is right in the center. There is gas reserves. And Israel is now drilling for gas, and Israel is working very closely with Cyprus and with Greece. The cooperation is phenomenal, Cyprus and Greece. And Israel is drilling for gas, and Europe, who wants to rely less on Russia for its gas, is now turning to Israel. It's turning to Israel for its gas. And guess what happens when you financially reliant on another country? Well, they don't bash you as much. Put it this way, they support you a little bit more. They give you a bit more time. So the gas deal is going to make a big, huge difference when it comes to policy in the UK government, in the European Parliament as well. It's going to take time, but it will be there, because they don't trust Russia. They don't want pipelines coming from Russia through Turkey, because then they rely on Turkey as well. So Israel will become a huge gas supplier and a big player in this market. It's already supplying to Egypt and to Jordan, which only solidifies the relationship between them. So Israel is currently the safest it has ever been, the strongest it has ever been since it declared independence. And we should be absolutely grateful for that. Where are Israel's biggest problems then lying? Internally. It's society. It's the only thing now that could possibly harm Israel, is its own people. The society in Israel is hugely fragmented. You have 20% Haredim, 20% Arab Israelis. Very few of that 40% participate in the GDP, in the economy of Israel. There are those that absolutely do participate, very few. And the rest of the 60% are not happy that they're footing the bill for those 40%. And you need to bring them into society. So there's a huge societal problems. Everyone knows, you go to Israel, that there are communities that just simply don't get on. So Israel needs to learn to get along. It has greater, as a democracy, certainly greater problems than any other democracy I can think of. But it holds and it maintains it. We have a prime minister in Bibi Netanyahu who's been there for a long time and fantastic. But we might have a new prime minister. When I say might, there's an agreement that Benny Gantz will come in the next 8 months, year or so. But who knows? Who knows? There might be another election. Who knows? As I like to say, let's skip the 4th election and go straight to the 5th, and let's see what happens. But that's what we have. We have Benny Gantz, and Benny Gantz will change policy. He's a lot more central. Bibi is a lot more right-wing. Likud is a lot more right-wing. Benny Gantz is a lot more central. So he will, what we might have is a relationship between a central government in Israel, proper central, within a centralized Democrat government in America, and what you might have is policy changing entirely in the Middle East. But we still have, as I said, 2 months of Trump, and we don't know what's going to happen with the 2 months. And I can tell you now, officials in Israel are holding their breath. They're worried, and I'll tell you why they're worried. Because when it looked like Biden had won the election, by all accounts had won the election, by all news broadcasts in America, even Fox News had won the election, there was no immediate public announcement from the office of the prime minister to congratulate Biden and Kamala Harris. Eventually, Bibi did tweet, and he said, congratulations to Biden and Kamala Harris. Didn't say president and vice president-elect. And this caused huge amount of furor in America. Bibi tried to downplay this congratulations because he knew it would absolutely rile Trump. Trump was not happy that Bibi was even congratulating it, and the Democrats were not happy that Bibi didn't congratulate the president-elect. But this is the only way that he could try and get away with it. So literally stuck between a rock and a hard place at the moment. So Israel has to remain quiet as well. Israel has to stay back and not push too much because it doesn't know what it's going to get. It doesn't know that Trump could throw his toys out of the pram and then we got problems. We saw Obama, for different reasons, do something similar to Israel just 2 months before he left. So again, when it comes to Israel, America is there for it. America is supportive. There's a whole new breed of Democrats coming up. There's a Hispanic and a Black community. Israel culture always remain a bipartisan issue when it comes to Israel. No matter if you are Republican or Democrat, we need them to support Israel. We need Israel to get along with, no matter who's in the presidency, Jeff. And that's important because of the future, because we cannot take risks one side or another. And the Jews in America know this very well. And all those supporters of Israel ensure that it remains bipartisan. But now we have a whole new generation of Democrats rising up. And this new generation of Democrats, Hispanic and Black, don't see Israel in the same light. There are a number of junior senators who don't support Israel, support the Palestinians, but they're very junior. Junior members of the House as well, but very junior. They're not having any impact at the moment. We have a president in Biden who totally is anti-BDS and supports Israel in every way, but we don't know what's going to happen in the future. The Hispanic and the Black communities that are the bedrock now of the future of the Democrat Party don't see Israel as even an issue. They don't have an opinion. And the problem is Israel needs to ensure that they don't create an opinionated problem that wants for itself. It doesn't create a problem with these communities because these communities will decide what happens in the future. Israel's very careful as well. But for now, it looks good. For now, we're going to be positive. We're going to remain positive. For now, Iran, Israel's biggest enemy, remains a greater enemy to its surrounding states and to America. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to stop there. I've said a lot. And I'm going to open up to a few questions. If possibly James Marlow wants to come in and wants to add possibly a few minutes, I'd love to hear from James as well. James, who can introduce himself, is phenomenally knowledgeable in the area, works very closely with the ZF, and I'm really proud to have him here alongside James.
Phil, can you demute James? David? Phil? Anybody? David, where's Phil?
No, I'm monitoring, but I can't. I've asked James to unmute himself.
Oh, James, can you unmute?
On mute. It's telling.
Oh, there you are.
No,
Okay, tried it 3 times and it wasn't working. So it's working right now. A great deal of information just came from Paul there. I'm the person. In the olden days, it used to be that if you were doing a radio show or a television show and there was an outside broadcast taking place, in case the line went down, they had somebody back in the studio who would pick something up. So if you were actually on the radio as a disc jockey, you would just quickly flip a record on. And if it was a talk radio news station, then of course you would pick up something, maybe go to the news or a commercial break. In this particular case, Paul is at the airport, as you heard. We did hear quite a lot of dropouts, and a couple of times Paul's face froze a few times. So I was ready to step in with some current news. But during Paul's talk, I scribbled down a few notes. And I pretty much think that he made a fair amount of analysis on the current situation. A great deal of material was actually covered at that point, and I'm sure there could be questions for the next 3 hours. I will just take the opportunity to bring up what actually took place today in Israel. Firstly, some positive news, because for the first time today, officially, the Bahrain foreign minister arrived on one of his own planes, arrived in Tel Aviv with members of his government. They went off to Jerusalem. There was a press conference with Netanyahu and also with Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, who's visiting the region and took off some time to actually be at this press conference today. I had the opportunity to listen to this press conference, and it was great because they looked like that they were really, really good friends. And they confirmed that embassies were going to open in each other's countries, which we already knew. They confirmed a number of trade deals that were going to take place, which of course we already knew. The Bahrain foreign minister confirmed that the flights will start next week from his country to Tel Aviv. And if I just look down on my notes over here, just to see if I can find how many flights there were, can't find it at the moment, but there was a number of flights which are going to come in from Bahrain to Tel Aviv, also flying from Bahrain to Eilat, plus, if I remember, another 8 flights, which are going to be general cargo. So that's fantastic. And this pretty much shows this is a peace that is achieved not by weakening Israel, but simply recognizing that 2 countries, they focus so much on trade, on transferring some of their people for tourism reasons to each other so they can actually visit each other's country and boost the tourism market. And also at the same time, just recognize that both of the countries are very small, but both of them are focused on business, on trade, on tech. Bahrain has the investment. Israel, to a certain degree, has a lot of the brains coming up with all this software and all of this medical research. And that's where Bahrain and the other Gulf states can benefit from. So that's a piece of good information. Now I'll move down. You know, the news people, they normally start with the really bad stuff and then they end up with something really good. So I'm going to do it the other way around. So I'll move down to something which is not so positive in Israel. I'm not sure if Paul mentioned this. There was, again, another Israeli attack against Assyrian forces Iranian forces in Syria last night. The Iranians said that they lost a number of their soldiers. And note that Iranian soldiers in Syria, and we all know that they were there. And it's quite remarkable that under Netanyahu over the last 3 or 4 years, that Netanyahu has openly admitted that it is Israel who is attacking these bases, these Iranian bases inside of Syria. And this one particularly was just in the Damascus area, openly saying that it is us, that it is Israel, and simply because we will not allow the Iranians to make an entrenchment right on our border. We simply won't allow it. So we will take out as many weapon depots and weapons, ammunition and rockets, etc. And if it means sometimes taking out some of the Iranian soldiers, then that's exactly what's taking place. Now, some of the Iron Domes tonight have been moved to the north of Israel because Israel is possibly expecting a reprisal raid from either Iranian forces or Syrian forces, or perhaps both, or some of the Shiite militias inside of Syria to attack Israel. So again, those battery defense systems have been moved to the north. Also, with regard to Iran, I have to tell you that it is very sad to say that they have begun to feed the Iranian gas into centrifuges, which they've got a base, and it's an underground base. It's in a place called Natanz, or Natanz is I believe how you pronounce it. And this is according to a new report by the International Atomic Energy Agency. This is what the IAEA say, a clear violation of the nuclear agreement between the P5+1, those main countries, which actually included the United States, but Trump took us out of that, took them out, took the Americans out of it. But the Americans were involved, Britain, China, Russia, and I think Germany is still involved. I forget the actual countries who makes up the P5. So again, there are violations of this agreement, which is something that Israel said all the time. And yet it seems at the moment that this is not being mentioned so much in national news or international news, because I don't think that the nations around the world really know what to do with this, which is a shame. Just finally, with regard, and then I think it's fair to go over to some questions as well, with regard to this peace between the Sunni countries and between Israel, of course, it is true to say that it is Iran that has pushed these moderate Sunni countries towards Israel. But I have to tell you this, that if some type of Iranian deal is done with the new American administration, whoever takes the House in January 20, because I got a feeling, my gut tells me, my instinct tells me that we're still in for a little bit of a surprise, a shock as to what's going to take place between now and January the 20th. That's what I feel, but who knows? But whoever takes over on January the 20th, the White House, if it came down to the fact that the Americans were going to create a similar deal to the type of deal that the Obama administration created, then I think that the Middle East is in dire straits, because what you will kick off is an arms race. And it's not just a normal arms race, it'll be a nuclear arms race. And just earlier this evening, I was listening to some analysis from Israel, from a security expert, a strategic security expert in Israel, speaking on one of the channels, the Khan channel, which is the main Israel public broadcaster. And he was pointing out that if Saudi feel that they're being threatened by the Iranians building some type of nuclear energy, which of course they will use for their own purposes, then Saudi will not stop. It will not ask for permission. It will not go around the world and debate about this. It'll go to Pakistan. It'll pay Pakistani nuclear experts to make themselves to make Saudi some type of a nuclear armament. And this is a great fear for the Middle East. So America is in a very, very difficult position today, right now, in terms of its foreign policy. But it could be, if Joe Biden takes over on January the 20th, it could be that he might spend, firstly, the next 6 months to a year focusing on Corona and internal problems in America, and just leave the rest of the world to do whatever the rest of the world is doing. But we'll have to see. Now, I think it's enough time of myself speaking and also of Paul. And I've been told that we have some questions. So please open the floor for some questions.
Okay, I have a question. The first question from Jeffrey Hartnell. Can we demute him? Hold on. Hello? Demute Jeffrey?
There we go.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. Good evening, Paul. Good evening, James. Nice to see you guys. In view of who is likely to enter the White House, and I say likely, wouldn't it be better for Benny Gantz to become the de facto Prime Minister of Israel?
So it'd probably be easier if you make your mind Paul state, whoever you wish for us to answer that, or both of us. Maybe we should.
Both of you is good. I could get different answers.
Okay, well, I would say just in a few sentences, because I don't want to take too much time up here. Benny Gantz is Prime Minister in November next year. A lot can happen between now and then. One of the most important things, and I was speaking about this earlier on, is the budget. The Israeli budget has not been passed. It's been passed since 2019, which is against Israeli law. So you have to pass it by the end of 2019. That was thrown into disarray because there was an election in the beginning of March 20, January 20. March 2019. There was another election. And of course, there was another election earlier on to this year. They've actually keep putting it off every 3 months. Blue and White, led by Benny Gantz, wants that budget passed right now, specifically for 2 years, because that'll cover him to become prime minister in November. Netanyahu is delaying. And he's delaying for all sorts of reasons, hoping to get to the end of the year. They can put it up for another 3 months. And then depending upon the relationship between Blue and White and the Likud, which is very, very, very unsettled at the moment, there could be another election. So if there is another election, the polls are showing, believe it or not, that Naftali Bennett's party, which is a party called Yamina, is picking up quite a lot of seats. In fact, a new poll came out 2 days ago, which put Yamina, Naftali Bennett's party, on 25 seats, with the Likud on 28 seats, doing this from memory. And the Blue and White is around 10 seats, so they've gone up a couple. And the other one, Yesh Atid, is also around 15 seats. So the whole political structure has changed. And I don't think the Likud under Netanyahu is going to leave it like this until November. I think something's going to happen.
Okay. Okay, it's my turn. Do you think these peace deals will endure long term? Do you think anything can go wrong? For example, if there's another Gaza war, many would say to you that that's just a matter of time. What would you anticipate the expectations of Israel's new friends will be? Will they try and hold Israel back from retaliating, or will they stand in support of Israel's right to defend itself? I think that's one for Paul.
Or Charney.
Paul Charney.
Hi. Okay, can all hear me again? All right, thank you for that, James. So yes, I think these relationships will remain. The relations will remain because America is in the US's interest for them to remain. And don't forget, the US has offered a huge amount of support to the Arab countries and Muslim countries that are making deals with Israel. It's once you're in the agreement, to pull out would almost be a huge diplomatic problem. So it's not easy to walk out of it. You've moved the embassy to Jerusalem, not easy to walk out of that either. So I don't think that's going to change. So the only problem is if Israel and the Palestinians don't get on, and especially if there's a war in Gaza. Now, believe it or not, the Palestinian issue is not the number one issue for Arab countries around the world. It never was, it never has been. It's always been used as a tool simply to bash America and Israel, its proxy. That's all it's been used for. They really don't care that much about Palestinians. And you can see that by Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon, who are treated worse than any Palestinians ever been treated in anywhere in Israel. And Palestinian refugee camps in Syria and around the world. And they are seen as second-class citizens when they go to Kuwait and they go to Bahrain, and they're not treated with respect, the Palestinians. So it's not an issue for them. They don't really care that much. But if there is a Gaza war and it inflames, what we will probably see is them being very quiet, not coming in, because they would be stuck between the rock and the hard place. They would try to use their negotiations with Israel for positive, to try and influence, but very quietly and very much on the side. Once again, they don't see this as an interest for themselves now anymore. It was an interest. It was an interest for these Arab countries to have the Palestinian issue in Gaza, but it's not an interest for them anymore now. They have other issues that they have to deal with. So yes, these agreements will last, and they will last the test of time. And Israel's making very huge, fantastic, positive steps to bridge a huge amount of the society, the economical, the educational bridges between these countries. And the more you do that, the more difficult it is. More entrenched Israel is within these societies, and they are in the Israeli side, the more difficult it is to break away.
Anything else? Okay, I'll just ask you another quick question, a slow question. The Palestinian rejection has been strong and fierce. How do you think the Palestinian Authority will retaliate against these accords with UAE, Bahrain and Sudan? And how could they scupper further normalization with other Arab states?
Is there one for me? James, you come in for this one.
Oh, well, that's very kind of you. Thank you very much. With your alternatively. Well, firstly, they have reacted. The Palestinians have reacted, and they've used the word traitor. And they used it when there was talk of a signing. They used it when the Emirates plane landed in Tel Aviv. This is before the official signing. And remember, that aircraft actually had hundreds and hundreds of, well, actually millions, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of medical aid, not for Israel, but for the Palestinians. And what did Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, that was the name I was trying to think of. What did he do? He refused it. He refused to accept any of it because he said it was a political gesture and it wasn't meant for anything. Now, he's okay, and his colleagues are okay, because don't forget, they're getting hundreds of millions of dollars of aid from around the world. And if you look at some of the very nice palaces in Ramallah and some of the other people living around there, it's very hard for the Palestinians. And that's why if I get into a debate on social media, which with a sensible person, I don't waste my time with people who are not very sensible, I point out that I'm actually more pro-Palestinian than they are in some cases. How come? Because the difference with me and them is that I'm actually supporting the individual Palestinian who doesn't have a voice. Those Palestinians in Ramallah and Tulkarem and Kalkilia and Jenin and Jericho and 80% of Hebron. And there was one other city that Israel gave over. I support them because if the radio stations in the Palestinian autonomous areas or the television stations in the or even the newspapers write something against Abbas, they're shut down, they're raided, they're arrested. Yes, sometimes they come back on the air 3 months later, but again, the whole output of their news agenda is keeping in line with the PLO. This is not the type of peace that Israel ever wanted to do with the Palestinian Authority, because if you have a dictatorship that is controlling those people, they don't have a voice. And the only way we get to hear about this is when individual low-key journalists go in there with their cameras and they do interviews with them. And that's how we get to find out. Sometimes they don't want to be facing the camera. Sometimes they are. Sometimes it's just a voice. And on occasions, it's actually changing that voiceover. So, as I've said so many times before, the Palestinians are missing the train, and eventually there'll be a train and it will be the last one, because the Sunni Arab moderate states will not be waiting for the Palestinians, as Paul said. They will be moving forward and they will be creating ties with Israel for the benefit of themselves, their people, their country, and also for their security. And the Palestinians are left on the side. And that's a shame for those individual Palestinians, but they're just being misled by their leadership.
Okay. You can put the virtual hand. If you want to ask a question, you don't have to wave your hands around. Go on into the chat, into the participants, and there's a virtual hand, and we can ask you. Hopefully, you can ask us some more questions. We're nearly at the end, so we can still take another couple of questions.
They can also ask through the chat room if they'd like to write a question that way.
Say that again?
Yep.
The chat room. to send a question through the chat
room. Yeah, there's nobody in the chat room.
No.
All right. Well, I'll just carry on for the time being. We're nearly there, so maybe another one or two questions. What's your opinion on the normalisation of relations with these new Arab states so far? Do you think it will spread to other Arab states when they see the benefits of rapprochement with Israel?
That's the poor Charney.
Right. Okay, we're back in. So I just wanted to come back on Jeff's question as well, just to add a little bit to it. And is a Biden or a Trump presidency better for is Benny Gantz or Bibi better now that Biden's come in? So yeah, it's a good question. I just want to add one point to James, who was absolutely correct in what he said. Just one more point to it, that it depends who you are in Israel. If you're on the right, then no, it's not better, because a Biden and a Gantz cooperation means pretty much giving up everything in negotiation, giving everything that the Palestinians want. That's how they see it. Whether it's true or not, we don't know. But if you're on the left, then you say absolutely, it's fantastic. You know, it's always like two opinions. And if it's Bibi, but I think more to the point, I think you want also the personal relationship. So Bibi has had a decent personal relationship with Biden. Not the best, but it's not like he had a real breakdown like he had with Obama. And Benny Gantz is very new, so he hasn't had that much political experience foreign-wise. You got to remember, he's come straight from the army. He was from Matkal, he was head of the army. Then he you got to wait 3 years before you can enter politics. So he did a little bit of business and consulting, and now he's in politics, and it's all internal. He hasn't done much foreign politics. So he's a very bright guy, and he'll learn. But he needs a lot of it. He hasn't got the experience that Bibi has. But the other point that I wanted to make is Trump is very volatile. Biden is not. Biden is not going to hold the entire country to Israel, who he does love, and he does absolutely see his partnership with the US. He's not going to hold the whole country to account because of his own relationship with Bibi, whereas Trump might do that. So again, the answer today is depends, if that helps. Coming back to the Abraham Accords, will this spread? So I think Israel is making huge attempts to make these accords successful. With ambassadors, Israel's been reducing its foreign ministries around the world because of budgetary issues, but these ministries are going to be full on. So it also depends who it is. The UAE is going to get a lot more cooperation with Israel than Bahrain. Bahrain's very small. With one city, Manama, and Sudan will be. It's not a big player in the world in the world arena, but if Israel can show the benefits, the huge cooperation, I can see these countries prosper from bringing close to Israel. All these countries. Whenever you visit, I've visited Bahrain and the UAE many years ago. And everyone says, "Are you worried that because you're Israeli and all that?" But I had a UK passport, so I said it was never a problem because they love Jews. They really do. They've always said, you know what? If you need a lawyer, or if you need a doctor, it must be Jewish. That's always been the case. And Bahrain is taking care of its Jewish community, hugely. It never has an issue with it. And I think we're transitioning into a new phase where Arabs are literally seeing a lot of these Arab countries, modern Arab countries, not the dictatorships, not the totalitarian, not the extremists, which there are plenty, but these new modern Arab states are seeing, actually, you know what? These are our cousins. We've got more in common with them than we got with the others. And that's what you're seeing with modernization in a lot of these countries. So yes, hopefully it does catch fire, and hopefully it does continue. And not just that. I mean, we're talking about Muslim countries like Indonesia, possibly. And that's what you want to see. But this will take time, and this needs momentum, energy, and push from the US. And within the Biden government, he hasn't got the manpower. He hasn't got Kushner. He hasn't got Pompeo. He hasn't got all of these guys. They're going to be focused on, exactly as James said, COVID, economy, and bring the Palestinians back in. So it should continue, but it's not going to happen on its own.
No. Do you think you mentioned it right at the beginning about Biden? Do you think the American policy towards Israel will change under Biden? And I read this morning that Netanyahu, for the first time, spoke to Biden over the phone, apparently.
James,
Okay, well, let me take the last one first. Normally we say Rishon, Rishon, the Acharon, Acharon, but I remember that last one. So I didn't hear about that. If there was a conversation that took place, may or may have not happened. I would imagine, in fact, based on what it is that I know, how the Prime Minister's office works in Israel, the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, and also the White House, because I know somebody over there in the White House. I would say that they being Joe Biden and Bibi Netanyahu, have had a telephone conversation since November the 3rd. It cannot be that they have not had a conversation. They have such a good relationship. It goes back many, many years. Of course, Trump got on very well with Bibi, and Netanyahu is very thankful for this current administration. But I have no doubt that Netanyahu has spoken with Biden, and it's just been kept very quiet. And Paul picked up on this right at the beginning while he was speaking. Netanyahu was put in a difficult position because Trump is somebody who still reckons that he will somehow hang on and stay in the White House. But at the same time, if he gives official praise to what's been called President-elect Biden, Trump could turn on him. So he was in a very, very difficult position. But I just want to come back to something that Paul said, and I'm very glad he brought up this name, a very famous name, the Abraham Accords. And it's the Abraham Accords for one reason, and Paul mentioned the name cousins. We are cousins, and that's exactly why they came up with the name Abraham Accords. Our cousin, the cousin of us being Yaakov, and his father Yitzhak, our cousins is Ishmael. Arabs trace them back, all the way back actually to Ibrahim, to Abraham, to Abraham. But also Ishmael, their religion, although the religion of Islam wasn't actually created until the beginning of the 700s as such, they still trace it back to Ibrahim, but it came specifically from Ishmael. That's our family. We're all connected. They are our cousins. And because of that, we come up with the name, the Abraham Accords. Us, Yitzhak, and them, Ishmael, are connected through Abraham, the Abraham Accords. And that's wonderful. And that's why at this point, it's going really well. I know it's brand new days. I know that. But I have to tell you, the news networks around the world, how they condemned this particular piece. Why? Because they said the Palestinians weren't invited to the table. The Palestinians weren't invited to Washington. The Palestinians have no say. It's not fair. And these Arab countries, they were never at war with Israel. So it's not really a peace. What's it all about? But they were still covering it. Well, let me tell you, the Palestinians were invited, but they refused to come. Don't forget, the Palestinians called them traitors. We're not going there. We're not going to visit Washington. We're not going to have anything to do with Trump or this Republican administration. So it's not true, again, what these news networks said about the Palestinians not being invited. They refused to come to the table. They refused to even, with regard to this current Trump peace plan, they refused to say, you know what, this is rubbish, but we're going to give you a counteroffer. And this is our counteroffer. They didn't even say that. They just called Donald Trump and his administration a lot of bad names. That's not the way to behave.
And we have a question from
Jeffrey Hartnell.
Yeah. If you'd like to unmute yourself.
Thanks, guys. Sorry, guys. It's a bit of a supplementary one, really. We now have a possibility, certainly by November, assuming there are no further elections, of potentially two leaders for Israel and America who are both more on the dovish side of things, a more liberal agenda. Could it then cause and force the Palestinians to show their true hands, forcing them to sit round a table for peace, which may upset hardliners on both sides?
Jeff, thank you. It's a good question. So first of all, Israel has shown it can give up for peace. And it did so when it came to Gaza. Now, there was a lot of problems with that. Most people disagree with what Israel did, but it did it. Ariel Sharon gave up the entire Gaza for, you could say for peace or not for security, but he did give it up. And everyone thought, you see, we can do this. We can do this. Now the world will see that we, Israel, have done it. We've given, we've made the steps. We put all of Gaza, run it yourself, and handed it over to Fatah and to the PLO. And now no one will blame us. No one can hold us to account. We saw the same thing at Camp David, where Ehud Barak offered Arafat 97% of what he was asking for. And you'll see it's never going to be our problems. But you know what? We were blamed. Israel's blamed anyway. Israel's always going to be blamed. Israel's always going to be held to account if nothing happens. We saw that. We saw that because of the agenda. But now you've got liberals. Are the Palestinians going to be held to more account when they don't come to the table? Well, I think patience is running out now with the Palestinians. I certainly do. And I think they will be held slightly more to account. But they will find every reason to duck and dive and to say no. Because their entire reason for being is not as a Palestinian people, as a Palestinian state. You've got to remember there's a whole lot of these plans that are put together to create a Palestinian state, similar to like Libya, which doesn't work. How are you going to create a democracy, or how are you going to create a state out of a number of different Palestinian families who don't get on, each sitting in a different area? I don't know. The entire reason for being is to be a force against Israel, and that's where they get their funding from as well. So it's very difficult for them to change that. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I'm saying it's very, very difficult. And they didn't want that. Arafat was always just a simple terrorist. That's all he saw. That's all. He didn't want to make peace at all. And all he did was hold Israel to account. That's all he did. Abbas was supposedly better, but he's done nothing. Simply, he's not capable. So yes, the Palestinians should be held to more account. Yes, patience might run out, but no one's holding their breath because nothing's going to happen anyway. Not for a long time.
And if I may just add on top of that as well, just to remind you that Bibi Netanyahu came back to power in 2009. Wow, a long time ago, 2009. And I remember very clearly, I was living and working in Israel. I was a correspondent in Israel, and I still had many connections with some of the government departments over this. Tzipi Livni was appointed a minister. Remember Tzipi Livni? She was appointed a minister, and her task was to get the peace process back on track. And the Americans were very much involved in this. And Israel had to do a very difficult concession. And that was a complete and utter settlement freeze. That settlement freeze went on for 10 months. That was supposed to be a gesture towards the Palestinians under Mahmoud Abbas, not Arafat, because Arafat was already by this time out of the picture. And yet at the end of the 10 months, they still did not come back to the table, refusing to come to the table. And I remember Tzipi Livni, who actually was on the right of the political spectrum in Israel. And then she moved to the center, and then she moved to the left, and she moved further to the left, which is quite extraordinary because I think that she's the only MK in Israel who's been with 4 different political parties, each getting into the Knesset. So that's quite a record. I don't think anyone has actually beaten her with 4 different political parties. Initially the Likud, and then Kadima, and Hatznua, which was her party, and of course it was Labour. So there you go. That's not bad for a memory. However, she said on Channel 2, which is today it's known as Channel 12, same station, same people on there. She said on Channel 2 in an interview, "I don't understand Mahmoud Abbas. He just won't compromise one little bit, not one little bit." That was back in 2009. Now, you have to remember what a settlement freeze is. And I just want to touch on this because I hope we just got time for a few more sentences from myself. And that is, settlements is not like the big caravans and the right-wing extremists and things like this. Settlements in this particular case was those who've been given permission to extend their houses. There was a complete and utter construction freeze on those houses being extended. In other words, it was half done at the back. So they would take up some of the garden. That was all completely frozen under this particular rule. And with regard to settlements, and a lot of people misunderstand that, I tend not to use the word settlements, but I'm using it for a language that we can communicate in because it could be some of the viewers tonight don't understand Jewish communities. but I tend not to use the word settlements because I think it's a wrong word. These are people who have lived in this area, been encouraged to move out by successive Likud and Labour-led governments for cheaper housing. So those who have lived in Hampstead and Golders Green and Hendon and seen that you get less and less for your money, or at least you did a few years ago, you want to move out. So it's Edgware, it's Bushy, it's further out to get more for your money. That's exactly what these people did. They have kids. Those kids grow up. They get married. They also want to go ahead and get a place of their own. They can't move back to Jerusalem where their or their parents came from, or their grandparents, because it's too expensive. So they have to live within the neighborhood. That's where the extra housing comes from. It's not building up new settlements. It's actually just having more houses because there's a population growth, and you cannot stop population growth. And that's what Netanyahu is all the time.
Okay, Paul's itching.
There's another question.
So, well, thank you very much, Paul and James. That was, I felt, one of our most interesting evenings. I think I've learnt more about Israel than reading the Jewish Chronicle.
Well, I hope so.
But especially as Paul, as you went over the top by actually not letting us down and talking from Heathrow Airport. I really appreciate that. So have a good flight. I'm sure it's going to be a bit warmer than it is here. Thanks again, and good night to everybody else. Drive carefully, whoever's going, wherever they're going, and hopefully we'll see you next week. Good night.
Thank you very much. Good night.
Thanks, James.